Concepts and categories. When you walk into a general merchandise store like a Walmart or a Tesco, you assume that you will find a particular and predictable level of organization. There's a section for children's clothes, a section for hardware, a section for toys, and a section for food and groceries. Within each of these sections, there is often another predictable subordinate level of organization. For example, within the food and grocery section, products are organized by bakery items, fresh produce, meat, dry goods, and sometimes things are even suborganized further by brand, function, and ingredient within those divisions. You expect to find frozen pizzas together, a taxonomic grouping, and you may also find pasta sauce and pasta near each other, a functional grouping. These divisions are predictable because most stores use similar grouping. They help shoppers to know what to expect and where to find things. If you were looking for frozen carrots, you would expect to find them near frozen peas. If you were looking for canned hearts of palm, which could be an ingredient you've never purchased before, you might try the canned food section because that's where you find other canned foods. In other words, these stores are organized conceptually. The conceptual groupings are designed around the kinds of products being sold and what they are used for, and the groupings make it easier for shoppers to find what they need. Your mind works in much the same way. Your thoughts and memories, though represented at the neural level by distributed connections of neurons, are organized conceptually, and these concepts reflect the organization in the world. Dogs and cats are natural groupings, as well as functional relationships. Bread and butter go together. This chapter is about concepts and categories. Objectives. On completing this chapter, you should be able to achieve the following: describe and define what a concept is and what categories are. Understand and explain the primary reasons why people form concepts. Understand and explain the primary functions of concepts. Understand the different theories and accounts of conceptual representation, how they are similar, how they differ, how they can be tested. What are concepts and categories? Concepts are a way to organize our memories and our thinking. Concepts provide structure to the mental world. We rely on them to make predictions, to infer features and attributes, and to generally understand the world of objects, things, and events. The study of concepts, categories, and thinking is one that emphasizes how categories are created and learned, how concepts are represented in the mind, and how those concepts are used to make decisions, solve problems, and drive the reasoning process. Figure 4.1 shows a hypothetical arrangement among lower-level perceptual responses: perception, attention, working memory, structured representations, concepts in memory, and higher-order thought processes, cognitive behavioral outcomes. At the lower levels, information has not been processed and is essentially in a raw, primitive form. Primitive representations are things like edges, colors, basic shapes, phonemes, etc. These primitive representations receive input from the sensory system, the retina, the cochlea, etc. In order for the cognitive system to be able to plan and make decisions, these primitive representations need to be processed and structured in some way. In the previous chapter, the discussion was on memory and how thinking is influenced by memory. This chapter discusses the implications of mental representations that have a significant degree of structure. It examines thoughts and ideas that are similar to each other, representations that share activations and overlap at the neural level, and representations that have sufficient structure and coherence to afford prediction, inference, and utility. In other words, this chapter is about concepts. Categorization and knowledge. Organize the sensory world into meaningful, usable mental structures. You have the sensory world box, which goes to the structured organization in memory, which goes back and forth from behavior, problem solving, induction, planning, understanding. Fundamental cognitive mechanisms are recruited to bring structure to the sensory world. Figure 4.1. A hypothetical arrangement that shows the role of concepts and other thinking behaviors. The outside sensory world is structured according to features, similarity, and rules. We use this conceptual information to make decisions, to reason, and to solve problems. In this chapter, I generally use the word category to refer to the objects, things, or events in the outside world that can be structured into groups, and the word concept to refer to the mental representation that denotes that category. Categories are groupings of things, natural or otherwise, that exist outside the mind. Concepts are how we represent these groupings in the mind. Sometimes the concept reflects the category fairly well, but this is not always the case. As an example of how categories of things might be organized and represented as concepts, consider figure 4.2. This is a collection of coffee mugs and cups that were collected from a Google image search on coffee cups. They are all readily identifiable as coffee cups. Some are more obvious than others, some have more standard features than others, and others have novel features, like a gun handle or a shelf for your cookies biscuits, which seems like a great idea at first, but your biscuits would slide off if you drank from the same side. When we learn to classify these objects and recognize them as members of the coffee mug category, we also learn to ignore some of the idiosyncratic and unique features and rely on the most typical and predictive features. But this process is not as straightforward as it seems, as many of the most common features, like being a cylinder, might also be found in members of other categories, for example, a drinking glass, canister, jar, etc. We might also notice that even those features which are strongly associated, like a handle, are not necessary for being a member of this category. Coffee mugs should be a really simple, straightforward category, but there is still a fair amount of complexity and variability. Despite this, most of us have formed a reliable concept of what coffee cups are, and we are likely to have very little difficulty making a classification decision quickly and easily. There are many kinds of coffee mugs. Figure 4.2. A selection of images of coffee mugs retrieved from a Google image search on coffee mugs. Although there is a great variety, we can still perceive some coherence. Very typical coffee mugs might seem to be better members of the category. With something simple and straightforward, such as a category like coffee mugs, it hardly seems to matter. After all, as long as you can put your coffee in it, it should qualify as a member of the category. But the formation of, or lack of, stable concepts and category boundaries can have very serious consequences. As an example, consider acetaminophen, the pain reliever commonly found in Tylenol and other over-the-counter headache and cold medicine. If you were asked to say what category you thought acetaminophen was a member of, you might say medicine or something like that. You would not say poison, and yet acetaminophen toxicity is a very serious issue. Every year, many people die from taking too much acetaminophen. A recent review found that acetaminophen poisoning was one of the most common causes of acute liver failure in the USA. It accounts for several hundred deaths a year and causes many more thousands of calls to the emergency room. It turns out that acetaminophen has a very narrow therapeutic window. Exceeding the maximum recommended dosage, even by a modest amount, can result in toxicity, hospitalization, and even death. This is exacerbated by the fact that acetaminophen is found in many over-the-counter medications, like cold and flu medications, so it may not be easy to tell if you have exceeded this dosage. Acetaminophen is correctly classified as a medication, but with that comes the incorrect assumption that it may be safer than it is. Categorizing something allows you to make predictions and assumptions, but in this case, categorizing acetaminophen as a safe, benign, over-the-counter medication may lead to errors. I do not wish to give the impression that acetaminophen is unsafe in general or that it should be avoided. Taken as directed, it is a very safe and effective medication, but the consequence of categorizing it as always safe would be incorrect. Categories allow people to make quick and usually accurate judgments, for example, coffee cup or not, but occasionally they come with a cost of misclassification, for example, safe medication or poison. Why do people categorize things? Why do people seem to rely on mental categories for thinking? A related question is, why do we as humans seem to have the concepts and categories that we do? One possibility is that humans form categories and form concepts that reflect the natural structure of the world. That is, I have a fairly good concept of dogs and cats because there is a natural distinction between the two groups. Cats and dogs are both members of the larger pets category and may even live together, but they are not the same. Cats and dogs are likely to fall into different categories whether we have nameable concepts for them, for example, the words cats and dogs, or not. Another possibility is that humans form concepts to help achieve goals. Below, I consider several key reasons why people group things into categories and represent these groupings and concepts. Stimulus generalization. People categorize things in part because of a natural tendency to generalize. Stimulus generalization is present in all species, and it means that an organism can extend a learned behavioral response to a whole class of stimuli. This would be seen even in the most primitive organisms. In the 19th century, William James noted that creatures extremely low in the intellectual scale may have conception. All that is required is that they should recognize the same experience again. A polyp would be a conceptual thinker if a feeling of hello, thingamabob again, ever flitted through its mind. Here, when James says polyp, he is referring to the tiny tentacled water organisms that make up corals, and when James says conception, he means the ability to form a concept and not the ability to conceive another polyp. This notion suggests that generalization, and with it the tendency to categorize and group members into clusters, is an inherent aspect of a functional cognitive structure. As was discussed in Chapter 2 on similarity, these generalizations are going to be guided by similarity, such that the response rates of a behavior to a new stimulus will be a function of how similar a new stimulus is to a previously seen stimulus. Roger Shepard referred to this as the universal law of stimuli generalization. Efficiency. Another reason that people categorize things is efficiency. Forming a concept for a group of things requires a reduction in the amount of information to be retained about all the members of the group. In other words, the concept condenses many experiences into one representation. One way to describe a category is as a behavioral equivalence class. This means that although a group or class of things may be different and many in number, we behave towards all of them in the same way. For example, my cat knows the sound of a can of food being opened, although there are many different cans and probably some of these cans sound different when being opened. The cat behaves in the same way towards the sound. The individual and unique characteristics of each can does not matter. The cat has efficiently represented a whole universe of food can sounds with a single behavioral response. We do the same thing with our own concepts. We are capable of representing many similar things with one core representation. This can be referred to as cognitive efficiency. Theories of conceptual representation may differ in terms of how much information is stored in the conceptual representation and how much information is lost. Most theories of conceptual representation assume that the concept stores general information with greater cognitive efficiency than many unique individual representations. This distinction will be discussed later in the chapter. Concepts are natural. Another reason why people categorize things is that the world of objects and things may be somewhat self-categorizing. That is, it may be that there are regularities in the world, both physical and functional, and that our job as inhabitants of the world is to learn about these regularities. This idea goes back to at least as far as the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. Plato suggests that, as learners, we cut nature at its joints when we represent the natural world. Plato was probably talking about how a hunter or a butcher might prepare an animal for eating. It is easier to cut the animal where the joints are rather than just hacking it apart. That is why we have chicken breast, wing, thigh, and drumstick rather than wings that are cut in half. There are natural ways to cut up an animal. Those natural ways exist whether or not humans decide on that. We can theorize that humans form the categories they do based around already existing natural boundaries. We have concepts for fruit, chickens, and coffee mugs because these things are similar to each other in the world. As we engage with the natural world, we have no choice but to categorize and conceptualize it along those lines. If we consider all of these things, the tendency to form generalizations, the possibility of an efficient central representation, and natural groupings that are present in the world, it seems that categorization is practically inevitable. The functions of concepts. The preceding section described the formation of concepts as a natural and efficient process. In this section, I address the following questions. What are some of the functions, cognitive and behavioral, of having concepts? How do concepts and categories affect the thinking process? How to react. Fundamentally, a concept is a cognitive representation that influences how a person reacts, which is why they can be described as behavioral equivalence classes, just like my cat who formed the behavioral equivalence class for canned food, see the preceding section. The concept can encapsulate experience and drive behavior. Once an object is classified as a member of a category, we can behave towards it as a member of that category. Let's use the example of winter squashes. This is a category that includes pumpkins, butternut squash, acorn squash, and Hubbard squash. As you will read later, I love winter squash and Hubbards in particular. A Hubbard squash is a large, light green winter squash about the size and shape of a rugby football, figure 4.3. It is somewhat unfamiliar to most people, though, but once a person is assured that it is a member of the winter squash category, they can behave accordingly. Figure 4.3, a Hubbard squash. On the left, a whole Hubbard squash. On the right, a Hubbard squash cut in half. And how do most people react to winter squashes? In the US and Canada, baking a pie is a common reaction. Pumpkin pies consist of custard-like fillings in a pastry crust and are very popular in much of North America. We call them pumpkin pies, but they can be made with other winter squashes, including the Hubbard squash. You can try to bake a Hubbard squash pie that will more or less taste like a pumpkin pie, or at the very least, you can look up a recipe for a Hubbard squash pie that will taste like a pumpkin pie. It is actually better, in my opinion. And because this unfamiliar winter squash is a member of a category you are familiar with, you might know how to cut into the squash, how to prepare it, and where to buy it. There are many other examples. A concert that is classified as classical music encourages a different attitude or style of dress than one that is classified as folk music. A wine that is classified as a dessert wine encourages it to be consumed in a specific way and probably not with a steak. This idea that categories help you know how to behave or react might also have troubling consequences on the thinking process as well. This tendency is at the root of many negative racial, ethnic, and occupational stereotypes. Because our minds have a tendency to generalize from whatever concepts we have and have formed, we may make helpful as well as unhelpful generalizations. We might even unconsciously adjust our behavior when speaking to a person from our own ethnic group as opposed to a person from a different ethnic group. We adopt different manners when visiting the physician than when talking with the receptionist at the same office. We harbor different attitudes towards some racial groups relative to others. Much of the research and literature on stereotyping and racial prejudice falls within the context of classical topics in social psychology and suggests that these categories can bias attitudes and perceptions in subtle and implicit ways. Predictions and inferences. Categories are also used for prediction. Prediction is related to the guiding of behavior but is more specific. In Chapter 6, I discuss how categories can guide an even more specific kind of prediction known as an inductive inference. When an object or an item is classified as belonging to a certain category, we can use the category to make predictions about other attributes that might not be immediately present, but that we know to be associated with the category. Consider again the Hubbard squash. On the outside it is pale green, lumpy, and oblong, but upon reliably classifying it as a winter squash, you might predictly correct that it will be orange on the inside and filled with stringy fibers and seeds, figure 4.3. This prediction is guided directly by category level knowledge. Communication. Categories are also an effective way to communicate information to other people. When we learn to generalize over a whole class of objects, we are usually averaging or summarizing our experience over multiple exposures or many interactions with a stimulus, but obviously this direct associative experience cannot be transferred to others. The most effective way to communicate with others is by referring to a known concept or category. For example, rather than relate the long process by which you discovered that the Hubbard squash was a winter squash and that it also has yellow-orange flesh, stringy fibers, and seeds, you can just tell your friend that the Hubbard squash is a winter squash. Granting the other person some knowledge of the squash's category membership gives that other person access to all the category level information. This idea relates the information denoted in concepts with the information denoted by words, and so some of the discussion on category learning and communication will also be covered in Chapter 5 on language and thought. Problem solving. Concepts and categories also play a role in problem solving. People often engage in problem-solving strategies and heuristics that involve finding the correct solution from memory. Rather than solve a problem by working through the solution process or applying a general strategy, the problem solver may search for the correct solution in memory. Finding this solution in memory will necessarily involve comparing the current problem to representations of similar previously solved problems. The idea of concept-based problem solving occurs in many domains. Expert chess players access store representations for categories of moves. Expert physicians are known to rely on the similarity of patients to previously seen patients. In addition, there seems to be a high agreement among expert physicians about how they form concepts of the reasoning tasks that they access upon seeing a patient. We will discuss more about the role of conceptual representations on problem solving in Chapter 10 and among experts in Chapter 11. 4.1 Theory in the Real World. Categorization is important for humans and non-humans alike, but it's also really important for corporations, companies, and machines. For example, most of us are aware that internet companies are working tirelessly to collect data on users, generate trends, and to classify things in order to make predictions based on what they think people want. One of the most obvious examples is the product recommendations on Amazon's shopping service. Amazon recommends new products to buy, new books to read, and new movies to stream based on your prior purchasing history and also your browsing history. Other companies like Netflix, Spotify, and Apple Music employ sophisticated algorithms to recommend new things to watch and listen to. Although the algorithms that these companies use are proprietary and not open to the public, they are going to use the same information that you use when forming concepts, experience, and similarity. We form concepts by noticing the similarity among groups so that we can make predictions about things. Shopping and streaming algorithms do the same and are able to recommend new things that are similar to your previous experiences. These patterns can provide insights into our own behavior and even show that how that behavior influences how companies operate. A recent study by Adam Hornsby and colleagues at University College London showed that our shopping behaviors are shaped by, and also help to shape, the way stores are organized. In their study, they collected the shopping receipts from millions of shoppers at a grocery store. They then applied a computational model to look for patterns in the items on the list. Essentially, they analyzed the co-occurrences of items on the receipts and were able to extract higher-order concepts from these. Those concepts tended to be organized around goals and patterns ranging from specific meals, i.e. stir-fry and summer salad, to general in themes, i.e. cooking from scratch or food to eat now. The authors showed that people shop according to themes and also that stores work to organize themselves around these themes, which then in turn reinforces the same themes-based shopping behavior. When we shop, we provide information to companies to help them organize their stores to make it easier for us to shop. Keep that in mind when you're doing your own shopping. If you buy vegan foods, for example, along with a specific brand of soap, it tells the store something about you, and that becomes part of how they plan, which then becomes part of how you plan. We're each observing the other, forming and modifying concepts, and adjusting our behaviors to make predictions. Theories of conceptual representation. Psychologists have described category representation in terms of several broadly defined theoretical approaches. The first class of these theories is sometimes called the classical view of concepts. This view emphasizes featured rules that delineate the category and thus define the concept. This includes the theories known as the semantic network and hierarchical approaches, which were discussed in the previous chapter on memory. These theories emphasize the similarity relations within and between categories and also the organization of concepts in memory. The second theoretical approach to the study of concepts is sometimes called the probabilistic view. Like the hierarchical view, this theory also emphasizes the importance of similarity within and between categories, but does not rely on a strictly definitional approach. Finally, researchers have argued for the role of knowledge and naive theories about the world in what is known as the theory view. These approaches have been instantiated in several different ways, and each makes a number of core claims about how much unique information about an individual object is retained in the conceptual representation, and how much unique information is lost in favor of general category-level information. The following sections consider each of these in turn. The classical view. The classical view is often described as classical because this is the way that theorists understood conceptual representation from classical times. In addition, we can think of this view as emphasizing categories as strict classes. There are two core assumptions in the most rigidly defined version of this theory. First, central to this theory is the idea of necessary and sufficient conditions as qualifiers for category membership. Second is the claim that categorization is absolute and all members of a class are of equal standing. This view probably seems far too rigid to be realistic, but it did seem to be the underlying theoretical framework that guided work on concepts and categories for most of the early era of psychology, and in many ways is still present in folk classification ideas. To understand the nature of these claims, consider a square. A square is defined as a shape with 4 equal sides and 4 right angles. As long as the shape has these attributes, we classify it as a square, and indeed the attributes are generally enough to allow the shape to be called a square. That is, each of these attributes is necessary and, together, they are sufficient for category membership. The definition of the square can be said to consist of these jointly necessary and sufficient conditions. In addition, once a shape can be said to possess these features and can be deemed a member of the square category, it is difficult to imagine how anything else would increase or reduce the validity of that classification. That is, given that 4 equal sides and 4 right angles is enough to be a square, it guarantees an equality of being a square. All squares are equal. Problems with the classical view. It is possible to imagine other examples of categories with this definitional structure. Even numbers are numbers that are divided by 2. A U.S. quarter is a certain size and shape and is produced by a government mint. But beyond some basic examples, the definitional account starts to break down. For example, if you were to draw a square on a sheet of paper right now, you might draw something that looks like a square, but it won't have the required 4 equal sides. That is, They are probably not exactly equal in your drawing, and yet you would still call it a square even if the sides were not exactly equal. More intriguingly, even something as basic as even numbers might not be as clear. A study by Armstrong and colleagues found that people reliably rate 2 and 4 as better examples of even numbers compared to numbers like 34 and 106. This is troubling for a definitional account of concepts because it suggests that even when exemplars of a category should be equally good members, people are still displaying an effect of typicality. In fact, the typicality effect is problematic for any definitional or rule-based account of concepts. In general, a typicality effect occurs when people rate some category exemplars as being better or more typical category members than others. A simple example would be to consider the dog category. Medium-sized common dogs, such as a Labrador, a Retriever, or a German Shepherd, might be viewed as more typical and as better examples of the category. Smaller, hairless dogs, or very large dogs, while still being just as much dogs as the Labrador, might be viewed as less typical. It is easy to imagine the typical examples: red apples, a four-door sedan, a 12-ounce coffee mug with a handle, the Apple iPhone. The typical items seem to come to mind almost automatically when asked to describe members of a concept. The typicality effect was investigated systematically by Eleanor Rosch. For example, in one study, Rosch and Mervis asked subjects to list all the attributes of common categories, such as tool, furniture, clothing, vehicle, etc. What they found was that some exemplars possessed more attributes that were also shared by many of the other members of the category. Other exemplars possessed relatively fewer of these common attributes. These highly typical exemplars were often the first ones to come to mind when subjects were asked to list exemplars. They were also likely to be rated higher in typicality. In other words, these highly typical exemplars seem to have a privileged status. This is slightly problematic for a classical view of concepts because a strictly definitional account predicts that these typical exemplars should not receive any behavioral privilege. Yet Rosch and Mervis showed that highly typical exemplars, those that seem to share many features and attributes with other category members, were classified and named more quickly. If people show a preference for typical exemplars, then they may not be relying on a definition or a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. The classical view also has had difficulty explaining family resemblance. This is the idea that members of a category or a class resemble each other but do not share a single defining characteristic. A family resemblance can be applied to real members of a family. Imagine a large family that gathers on holidays. It might be readily apparent to an observer that many of the family members look similar. Perhaps many have a certain hair color or the same kind of eyes, but it is very unlikely that there would be one trait that could identify the family members perfectly. We can imagine many categories like this: cats, carrots, candy, and Cadillacs. Each member will be similar to many other members, but may not be similar to all other members. The classical view came under close scrutiny in the middle of the 1900s regarding its failure to account for family resemblance. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1953, wrote, "Consider, for example, the proceedings that we call games. I mean board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Don't say there must be something common or they would not be called games, but look and see whether there is anything common to all. For if you look at them, you will not see something common to all, but similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them at that." In other words, the category of games is readily identifiable, and its members possess many similarities, but the claim is that we cannot identify a single defining feature. Wittgenstein's claim helped to usher in the modern understanding of concepts as family resemblance groupings. The idea was picked up by Eleanor Rosch in her paradigm-shifting work in the 1970s and 1980s. Rosch's work is discussed in this chapter. Hierarchies and the basic level. The basic idea of a hierarchical organization has existed in psychology for decades. One of the original and most influential models was the semantic hierarchy of Collins and Quillian. This model was discussed at length in Chapter 3 with respect to semantic memory, but the same model applies to a discussion of concepts and categories as well. One important aspect of a hierarchical scheme is the nature of each level. Even in a loosely organized hierarchy, each level has some fundamental characteristics that distinguish that level from others. As an example, consider the hierarchical representation shown in Figure 4.4. At the top level, also known as the superordinate level, the concepts plant, animal, vehicle tend to not overlap very much in terms of features and attributes, so that the between-category similarity is relatively low. Animals do not usually look or act very much like plants. but at the same time, within category similarity is also fairly low. There are a wide variety of plants, and not all act or look alike. Fir trees, sugar beets, and a cactus are pretty dissimilar, but all clearly are members of the plant kingdom. Because the similarity and feature overlap is low all around, similarity itself is not a particularly useful cue in terms of predicting category membership. In other words, you cannot really use featural overlap and similarity to classify the fir tree as a plant because while it might be similar to other fir trees, it is not similar to most other plants. At the bottom level, known as the subordinate level, there is a higher within category similarity, poodles look like other poodles, and also a fairly high between category similarity, poodles look a fair amount like Labradors. Again, because similarity and feature overlap is fairly high, it is not a very reliable predictor of category membership. Furthermore, to the extent that people do use feature similarity to make these classifications, it will need to take into account very specific features and often features that are unique. Corgis, as a dog breed, have a specific look, but their most noticeable features are likely to be those that are readily identifiable dog features. Hierarchical representations. Superordinate level. Low similarity within, low similarity between. Like plants, animals, vehicles. Then below that you have the basic level. High similarity within, low similarity between. You have cow, dog, cat, lizard. And then at the subordinate level below that, you have high similarity within and high similarity between. Poodle, Labrador, Siamese, short hair. So high similarity within categories mean poodles look alike, and high similarity between categories means poodle and Labradors look alike. Figure 4.4. Another example of hierarchical representation and categorization. Shown are hypothetical superordinate, basic, and subordinate category levels. Similarity within and between category members varies at each level. Primary object identification and classification occurs at the basic level. The middle level, referred to as the basic level, is a special case. Here within category similarity is high, but between category similarity is low. Although members of the dog category tend to look a lot like other dogs, there is not nearly as much overlap between members of the dog category, the cat category, the lizard category, and other members of the animal category. The basic level category is the level which maximizes within category similarity, while simultaneously minimizing the between category similarity. Because of this, similarity and/or features are a reliable cue to category membership. Dogs have a dog shape and are maximally similar to other dogs and do not have as much similarity overlap with other categories. The same is true for trees, cars, tables, hammers, mugs, etc. Basic level categories are special in other ways too. In the 1970s, Eleanor Rosch and colleagues observed that basic level categories are the most abstract level, at which the objects from a category tend to have the same shape, the same motor movements, and tend to share parts. Because the contrasting categories can be easily compared and similarity is a predictive cue, basic categories also show a naming advantage. That is, if you were shown a picture of a Granny Smith apple, you would likely respond by naming it as an apple and not as a fruit, the superordinate, or as a Granny Smith, the subordinate. Also, with respect to naming, basic level categories are learned earlier by children and listed first when subjects are asked to list members of a superordinate category. In general, the work of Rosch and many others has shown that although objects are classifiable at many different levels, people seem to operate on and think about objects at the basic level.